On a Monday morning, a man named Jake Wilson walked into his office at Meridian Technologies, just as he had done for 17 years. He was 54, a senior systems analyst, and the kind of worker who carried entire departments without ever demanding recognition. That morning, however, his manager called him into a small office. Sitting there was a representative from Human Resources. The words were brief, delivered without hesitation. "Jake, your position is being eliminated. Please clear out your desk by the end of the day." Jake did not argue. He did not plead. He simply nodded once, walked back to his desk, and quietly began to gather his belongings. A family photograph, a mug his son had made in high school, a small cactus that had somehow survived under fluorescent lights for nearly 2 decades. Around him, younger colleagues glanced nervously in his direction. Most of them had once been his trainees. They had grown comfortable building code on top of systems he had designed, never realizing how much of the company's foundation rested in his careful hands. None of them knew the older architecture as he did. None could navigate the custom tools he had written or the buried layers of credentials only he understood. One coworker from marketing stopped by with a look of disbelief. "Jake, this doesn't make sense. You practically built this place." But Jake simply offered a small shrug. Times change. Companies move in new directions. He would not create a scene. When he finally walked out, his manager stepped into the hallway. There was no handshake, no farewell. Only watchful eyes ensuring that Jake left the building. What none of them realized was that, over the years, Jake had become the most essential man in that company. Not because he sought power or recognition, but because he was steady, thorough, and always prepared. Long ago, at the request of the legal team, he had established strict audit protocols, and he had quietly kept his own copies of sensitive records. As Jake sat in his car outside the 12-story building where he had spent most of his adult life, he looked at the badge he had just surrendered. It had been renewed 16 times. He started the engine, pulled away, and thought to himself, Wednesday would be an interesting day. Jake had joined Meridian Technologies when it was nothing more than 2 modest floors in a business park. Back then, his daughter was in kindergarten. By now, she was preparing to finish graduate school. Over those years, the company grew, merged, and rebranded, yet Jake remained its constant presence. He had turned down offers from competitors because, to him, loyalty meant something. His wife, Andrea, often joked that the servers at work were his second family. And perhaps she was not entirely wrong. He knew every line of code, every workaround, every forgotten solution buried deep within the system. The infrastructure he had built had survived 3 different CEOs, multiple acquisitions, and countless innovations that executives had praised for a season and abandoned months later. 5 years earlier, Daniel had become Jake's manager. Young, ambitious, the kind of MBA graduate who referred to the IT staff as resources instead of people. He spoke often of efficiency, digital transformation, and future-proofing, words that sounded impressive but usually meant cutting corners and doing more with less. At first, Jake tried to help him. He explained the depth of the systems, the fragile balance between old architecture and new demands. But Daniel rarely listened. Instead, he brought in a consultant named Jason Phillips. Jason was sharp-dressed, polished, and carried a Stanford degree he made sure everyone knew about. Soon Daniel and Jason were meeting privately, their voices dropping whenever Jake walked by. It was subtle at first, small changes in his access permissions, projects reassigned to younger colleagues, emails that no longer included him. Jake noticed. He always noticed. But he said nothing. He simply documented. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Andrea, she studied his expression. "You seem distracted. Is everything all right at work?" Jake nodded quietly, sipping his drink. "Just changes. Nothing I haven't seen before." But he knew these changes were different. He was being pushed aside, slowly, carefully, almost invisibly. And then he found it. During one of his routine security scans, a task he continued even when others no longer bothered, Jake noticed something unusual in the financial systems. Regular payments were being made to a vendor he didn't recognize, Apex Solutions Group. The records showed it was a newly registered company, with an address that traced back to nothing more than a rented mailbox. At first the amounts were small, almost invisible. But with each passing month, the payments grew larger. Jake copied the records, made quiet notes, and waited. He said nothing, for sometimes it is the quiet man in the corner who sees the most. The morning after Jake was let go, the silence in his home felt heavy. No alarm had pulled him from sleep, no commute awaited. Andrea placed a cup of coffee on his desk without a word. After 19 years of marriage, she knew when he needed space. When she left for errands, Jake unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a flash drive. Years earlier, when the legal department had required off-site backups for potential audits, he had arranged them. Everyone else had forgotten, but Jake had not. He plugged the drive into his personal laptop. Inside were internal emails, meeting notes, and financial records most employees would never see. As he sorted through the files, the pattern became undeniable. Nearly $1.8 million had been routed to Apex Solutions Group over 18 months. The approval trail led directly to the company's chief financial officer, Brian Wilcox. Jake kept digging. He cross-checked dates, compared figures, and soon discovered that the payments matched legitimate software license renewals. Only the amounts were inflated, sometimes by 15%, sometimes by 20%, small enough to hide but large enough to accumulate into millions. Then came the final confirmation. Apex Solutions Group was registered to Thomas Wilcox, Brian's brother-in-law. Jake leaned back in his chair, not with anger but with a cold, steady focus. For 17 years he had been the one who solved problems quietly, who protected data without recognition. And now the company had cast him aside, assuming he would simply disappear. But Jake was not disappearing. A text message arrived from Stephen, a junior analyst Jake had mentored. "Sorry about yesterday, total nonsense what they did. Phillips has already moved into your old office." Jake set the phone down without answering. The pieces were all falling into place. Daniel, the ambitious manager, and Brian, the CFO, had needed him gone before anyone connected the dots. They must have believed that once Jake was out of the building, the trail would vanish with him. But they had underestimated the man they had just discarded. By Wednesday morning, Jake sat quietly in his car across the street from Meridian's headquarters. The building looked the same, but everything had changed. In the passenger seat rested his laptop, already prepared. At exactly 9:15 a.m., Jake sent an email. The subject line was simple: "Financial irregularities. Urgent review needed." The message contained a brief summary of what he had uncovered about the Apex payments. It was clear enough to raise alarm, but he left out the family connection. If Daniel, his manager, was involved, panic would reveal it. If not, he would start investigating. Either way, Jake would learn something. By 9:45, his phone rang. Daniel's number lit up the screen. Jake let it go to voicemail. The message was hurried. "Jake, we need to discuss your email immediately. Call me back." He didn't. Instead, he drove to a coffee shop and waited. At 10:30, another email arrived, this one from Human Resources. The tone was cold, formal. "Mr. Wilson, your recent communication may violate confidentiality agreements. Any further action could result in legal consequences." But Jake had never signed any separation agreement. The threats were empty. At noon, he opened a safe deposit box at his bank. Inside was another backup drive, one containing older but critical records. Among them were logs showing who had been granted access to the company's financial systems and when. The entries were precise. 18 months earlier, Brian Wilcox had requested expanded approval rights, exactly when the Apex payments had begun. Back home, missed calls filled Jake's phone. Daniel, Vanessa from HR, and even Jason Phillips, the consultant. Interesting. Clearly, his message had struck deep. Then came an urgent note from Stephen, the junior analyst. "Jake, people are saying you sent some crazy email about fraud. Phillips just called an emergency meeting. They're cutting off your access to everything. What's going on?" Jake typed a short reply. "Don't get involved, Stephen. Just watch." By mid-afternoon, another call arrived, this time from Brian Wilcox himself. His voice was calm but strained. "We should talk, Jake. There's been a misunderstanding." Jake answered only once. "Is that what you call it?" Brian tried again. He offered severance, references, even money for Jake's silence, but Jake ended the call. Minutes later, HR emailed with a doubled severance package, complete with a confidentiality clause. They were scrambling now, but they still believed Jake was just an aging technician with little fight left in him. They had no idea how wrong they were. That night, Jake worked late in his home office. Piece by piece, he traced the trail of money. What he uncovered stretched beyond Apex Solutions Group. 3 years earlier, another vendor had appeared, Lakeside Business Solutions. The invoices were inflated, the services vague or never delivered. The company existed only on paper, and its registered owner was none other than Patricia Wilcox, the CFO's wife. The scheme was clever in its simplicity: create legitimate-looking vendors, approve inflated payments, and hide the fraud inside ordinary expenses. Auditors scanning for outright fabrications would never notice. Over 3 years, more than $4 million had quietly slipped away. But there was more. Emails revealed Daniel's involvement. He had not simply looked the other way, he had helped facilitate the process. In return, his department had been granted budget increases while others were cut. Even Jason Phillips, the polished consultant, had been hired through irregular channels. His real task had never been modernization. It had been to remove the one man who might notice the pattern: Jake Wilson. By Thursday morning, Jake had compiled everything into a thorough report: spreadsheets showing the numbers, business registrations linking the shell companies to the Wilcox family, emails tying Daniel to the scheme. The evidence was overwhelming. Instead of sending it to the entire board immediately, Jake reached out to Robert Chen, a semi-retired board member he respected. Years earlier, they had worked together on a security project. Robert answered on the second ring. "Jake Wilson," he said, his voice surprised. "I heard you left Meridian." "Not exactly by choice," Jake replied. "Robert, I need 15 minutes of your time. It's important." They met in a quiet park outside the city. Jake handed him a sealed envelope with the printed report and a flash drive. "I'm not asking for my job back," Jake said evenly. "I'm not asking for money. I just want the truth in front of the right people." Robert studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "There's an emergency finance meeting tomorrow. Convenient timing, Jake. If this checks out, there will be consequences." As Jake walked back to his car, his phone buzzed. A message from Andrea. "Someone named Jason Phillips came by the house. Said it was urgent. I told him you were out." They were desperate now. And desperation, Jake knew, always revealed the truth. Friday morning was clear and bright. Jake sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, waiting. At precisely 8 a.m., his scheduled email reached every member of the board. Attached was his full report: every figure, every registration, every email that tied the fraud together. By 9:30, word began to spread inside Meridian. Executives were pulled into closed rooms. The CFO was confronted. Daniel looked pale. Jason Phillips tried to distance himself. The quiet man they had dismissed had set the entire machine in motion. Later that day, Robert Chen called. His voice carried a mixture of gravity and satisfaction. "Jake, it's a storm in here." Brian confessed, trying to blame Daniel. Daniel denies everything. Phillips insists he knew nothing. But the board isn't buying it. Forensic accountants estimate more than $5 million diverted. We've suspended all 3. The board wants to talk to you about returning. Not as an analyst, but as chief security officer, reporting directly to us. Jake had expected such an offer, but still he paused. Returning meant stepping back into the same building that had cast him aside without hesitation. Yet now, the balance had shifted. This time, he would set the conditions. On Monday, he walked through the lobby of Meridian once again. The security guard greeted him differently now, with quiet respect. In the boardroom upstairs, he placed a folder on the polished table. Inside were his terms: full authority over audits, an independent budget, veto power on technology spending. The board hesitated, but Jake remained calm. This fraud happened because no one was watching. That ends now. By noon, they had agreed. 6 months later, Jake sat in his corner office overlooking the Columbus skyline. The company had changed. The fraud was exposed, the money largely recovered. Brian faced sentencing, Daniel stood trial, and Jason Phillips was being brought back from overseas. The IT team now reported to Jake, though he had promoted Stephen to manage daily operations. The young man had potential. He only needed someone to see it. Andrea stepped into his office, smiling. "Ready for lunch?" she asked. Jake rose, taking his jacket. As they walked through the department, voices hushed, not from fear, but respect. Everyone knew what had happened. They knew he could have destroyed the company, but instead he had saved it. In the elevator, Andrea asked softly, "Are you happy?" Jake thought for a moment. The anger from those early days had long since faded. What remained was not joy, but something steadier, satisfaction, completion. "I'm good," he said quietly. Outside, the October sun warmed their faces. His phone buzzed with a message from Robert Chen, another unanimous vote approving his expanded budget. Jake slipped the phone back into his pocket and smiled faintly. Some bridges collapse under their own weight. Others, once repaired, become stronger than before. Jake Wilson had built this one carefully, and this time it would stand.